So today we're going to be doing things a little bit differently, but we'll get to that in just a bit. Over the past few weeks, we've been talking about that phrase, put into practice. So put into practice your faith. We talked about abiding, so being deeply rooted in Christ. We talked about curiosity and Sabbath. We talked about shalom, and last week we heard from Paula, who spoke about putting into practice interculturalism. And today we come to one of my favorite topics, which is putting into practice justice. And perhaps the most important thing that I can say before we kind of dive in is that justice and shalom really go together. Justice is how we participate in shalom. Justice is what shalom looks like in action. Now, our text today is one that's quite familiar, and it's kind of challenging as well. Jesus tells the story of great judgment. The nations are gathered before him, the sheep are separated from the goats, the righteous inherit the kingdom, and the others do not. But the surprise of the passage is not that there is judgment. The surprise is where Jesus is found. The king says, "I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me." Now, the righteous are confused. When did we see you? And those on the other side are also confused. Lord, when did we not see you? Neither group recognized Jesus, which is kind of the shocking part of the passage. Jesus identifies so completely with the vulnerable, the marginalized, the suffering, and the forgotten that to encounter them is to somehow encounter Christ. The question is not merely whether we believe in Jesus. The question becomes, do we recognize Jesus where he has chosen to be found? Now, this passage is often read in relation to charity, and that's a part of it. But I think Jesus is inviting us into something that is so much larger, so much bigger. The issue is not simply whether people performed good deeds. Instead, it's about whether our lives reflect and are aligned with the values and priorities of God's kingdom, with the values and priorities of Christ. Throughout Matthew's gospel, Jesus proclaims that the kingdom of God is near, and he teaches us to pray, "Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven." Matthew 25 gives us a glimpse of what that prayer looks like when it takes on flesh. The hungry are fed, the strangers are welcomed, the sick are cared for. Prisoners are not forgotten. The vulnerable are seen, the forgotten are valued. And these are not just random acts of kindness. These are signs of God's kingdom breaking into the world. This is what participation in God's reign looks like. So perhaps we can lean into Guterres' words where he says, "To know God is to do justice." This is what Scripture reflects throughout, that the more we know who God is the more we can find God among the least of these. And the more compelled we are, not just to bear witness to hunger and bondage and poverty, but it's the more that we see Christ is found in the midst of an unjust world. There is Christ, beckoning and calling us, his disciples, to put justice into practice, to see Christ in the unexpected places, and to not simply see people, but to engage them. To know God is to participate in God's work in the world. To know God is to do justice. Walter Brueggemann puts it like this: the doing of justice is the primary expectation that God has of God's people. Not perfect theology or doctrine, not religious performance, but justice. Because justice reflects God's character. Justice reflects God's desire for the flourishing of creation. Justice reflects God's commitment to shalom. Justice is righteousness. the whisper, the work, the word that makes all things right. Cornel West says justice is what love looks like in public. Justice is love embodied. It's what happens when our concern for our neighbors moves beyond sentiment and into action. Today, I want us to ask ourselves, do we see where Jesus is? Do we recognize Jesus where he has chosen to be found? And will we embody justice, shalom, righteousness when we come face to face with Jesus, even in the most unexpected places? Today I've asked Dr. Monetta B to join us, and we're going to have a bit of a conversation about justice. Dr. Monetta is an associate professor of sociology at Ambrose University, and she is going to help us look at this through the lens of a sociological imagination and talk about the ways that this intersects with our theological imagination of shalom. Dr. Monetta has received both her master's and her PhD in sociology at the University of Calgary. No University of Calgary people, that's okay. All right. And she completed her undergrad in political science at the University of Alberta. Ooh. Sorry. Good thing you did your master's and PhD here. Her research focuses both on issues that surround social justice and criminal justice. Dr. Monetta is originally from Barbados and is an active member of the Caribbean community in Calgary. She is the president of the Barbados Canadian Association, and she is a member of the board of directors for the Calgary John Howard Society. Let's welcome Monetta. All right.
Something for short people?
Oh, sorry, I could have got you a regular chair. All right, good morning. So, Monetta, you said I can put doctor aside from now, right?
Absolutely.
All right, but when you talk to her, you call her doctor. So what is sociology, and how has studying it shaped or challenged your understanding of what it looks like to follow Jesus?
Well, good morning, everyone. I'm happy to be here to share with you. And there are a couple students from Ambrose in the audience, so special shout out to present and past Ambrose students. Sociology, simply put, focuses on social interaction, so how human beings interact with each other, how human beings interact with institutions like the church, justice system, which I study, healthcare, and how human beings interact with social structures in society. So that's a broad definition of sociology. Pastor Keither mentioned the sociological imagination, which is the idea that when we're understanding human beings and how human beings function, we have to link our understanding of individuals to the larger society. So we can never know how a person interacts or how a person became who they are without looking at all of the society, included institutions and including social structures. And it is in this linking of the individual to the larger system where I really find my faith, because I believe that my version of God is that God is a God who wants all of us to thrive. He wants all of us to live to our full potential. He wants all of us in the space that we exist in at any time and any place. His version for us, or his vision for us, is that as individuals, you know, the saying now is like living your best life, or that might be a few years ago, might be dating myself, but the idea of living your best life, it's that, but in a deeper way, where we are living up to the potential that has been placed within us. I think that, for me, is the highest form of justice, when there are no barriers to an individual living out their true potential. And part of what I do in sociology, the branch of sociology I study, is looking at those social barriers that prevent certain groups or certain individuals from reaching their full potential, and ideally working towards eliminating, we'll get to the idea that is quite lofty, but working towards eliminating those barriers so that individuals can live out their full God potential.
Wonderful. So your work specifically engages with the justice system and social justice. So how does being a Christian, a Christ follower, shape the way you understand social justice and criminal justice?
I'll start by explaining a little bit about what I do. My work in sociology started as a criminologist, and part of what got me into this field was shortly after I graduated my undergrad, I was working with young offenders, and just particularly the groups that kind of I connected with were racialized groups and their experiences in the justice system. And when I think about when I spoke to them and later did research with racialized youth in particular, I realized, and this hit me, that, marginalized groups in society and how they experience the justice system, whether it's the root causes that get them involved in the justice system or their experiences after, I was really keen on understanding how is it that we can help these marginalized groups, particularly youth. And so it was through my study of that and through my focus on that I came to this thought or this belief system that the things that help you not, or for young people, but for all of us as we age, the things that prevent us from becoming involved in the justice system are also the things that help us to thrive in all of society. So we often speak about root causes. What are the root causes of criminality? If we tend to those root causes, giving people a good start in life, giving people opportunities in their childhood, giving people, making sure that kids go to school well-fed, making sure, particularly the groups I focus on, that they have a sense of belonging to a larger system. If we focus on those things, then we help young people and adults. We help deviate them from coming into the justice system, but we also help them to thrive in society across the board. And so the work that as I got further into the field and further into my study, I shifted from just looking at criminal justice to recognizing that social justice, giving everyone that opportunity I spoke of to live to their full potential, that is really what we're speaking about when we speak about moving away from the justice system. It is social justice. One of the I've quoted this with you in our conversation, Geetha, the idea that when we ask people to belong and live in an unjust society, but live justly, so abide by the laws, but the society is unjust to those individuals or those groups of individuals, that is a sense of injustice, forcing people to live in an unjust society. And so in order to kind of deviate people from the justice system, we as a society need to do the best we can to ensure that society is just for that individual and for those groups.
So what you want to do is, I can already jump down to the impossible question, right? So the goals, and so I will jump down to it, but the goals of sociology and the goals of theology, or Christian theology, Christ-centric theology, both of those visions of a just world can feel unreachable. So I'll tie back to her. One of the things you talk about a lot is restorative justice. And for those of you who know, my father worked in the criminal justice system as well, and he worked with young offenders, and he is a huge proponent of restorative justice and has seen the ways that it has transformed people's lives versus a punitive system. But it really goes against what it is that we believe. Right? So what I believe is that people should get what they deserve. And if you do something wrong, well, watch it. Imprisonment. right? So you get what you deserve. And restorative justice doesn't emphasize punishment. It emphasizes something along the lines of wholeness for the offender and the offended. So how do you reconcile these notions of the creation of a more just world? I'm making the question too big. How do we reconcile all of those things, the creation of a more just world, the ideas around restorative justice, along with our innate sense of wanting everyone to get what they deserve, with our theological ideas around grace and mercy, humility, and forgiveness? Only take 30 seconds.
You might need to prompt me if I forget. So first of all, I will acknowledge that the concept of restorative justice is easy in some cases and more challenging in others. So I worked a lot with young offenders, young people, who did something like petty theft under 5,000. And it's easy to say, well, they should not go to jail, because if Jacob isn't here, but he was in my youth justice class, and we always stress that sending people to jail, young people to jail, is the best way to create criminals, lifelong criminals. Jail is a breeding ground if you do that. And so it's easy to reconcile sending a young person who stole, I don't know, a pack of socks, I don't know, from a store. It's easy to reconcile restorative justice with those cases. What becomes more challenging, and it is more challenging for me, is when we have more difficult cases. For me, one of the things that triggers me is domestic violence, intimate partner violence, violence against children in particular that's a sticking point for me. So it becomes more difficult to reconcile this idea of restorative justice alongside punitive justice. And for those of you not familiar with restorative justice, it's the idea that when an individual commits a harm, that they're not just harming the immediate victim, but they're harming the whole of society. So all of the community, it's a very community-oriented way of seeing justice. The community is always implicated in harm that is caused, because we all feel it as a community. Restorative justice, however, also looks at how the community is somewhere implicated in the offense. So perhaps, what is it that we haven't given individuals that have contributed, and not led, contributed to their involvement in the justice system? So the community has to take a look at itself and consider and think, well, did I, as a member of the community, did I contribute in some way to this person's offending? Did we commit to ideologies, to value systems, to practices that have contributed to the position that this young person or this individual now finds themselves? So is the community, is the society, or our values, our belief systems, our practices, is it setting people up to fail or to succeed? And so while restorative justice doesn't say that, one of the key things is that people need to take accountability for their actions. And so the idea of sanctions or consequences, we all have consequences for actions, that is very much a part of restorative justice. People get consequences if they cause harm. But the other part of it is that holistic understanding of how that individual fits into the larger society, and perhaps is the society showing up in their lives in a way that led them to be involved in committing an offense. So when I think about ideas such as humility, such as grace, mercy, forgiveness, when we see an individual in the justice system, if we think about the ways we, as a society, contributed to their actions, the ways that we held on to ideologies or forwarded ideologies that might have harmed others, ideologies, I always tell my students, we know poverty is a problem in society. And we all say we would love to end poverty. On a daily basis, do we engage in practices? Do we have belief systems? Do we have ideologies that allow poverty to exist? The truth of the matter is that if we had ideologies that truly went against poverty, we wouldn't live the way we live, and poverty wouldn't exist. On some level, we are committing to ideologies that, at least in part, contribute to the social problem of poverty. And so where does the society and our beliefs, our systems, our values, our ideologies, where do we show up in people's lives in a way that leads to that intersection or that involvement in the criminal justice system? And when we think about it that way, when we think about individuals who have committed offenses that way, then it's a lot easier to show forgiveness and mercy while holding them accountable for their actions, but we also have to hold ourselves as a society accountable for our actions and our belief systems. And that requires a whole lot of humility. And I found myself having to be very humble and think about this differently as you encounter involvement with offenders.
So the two are, I always talk about how, we talk a lot about moving towards a more equitable world. That's one of the statements in our values. And it is unreachable, and I recognize that. Should we still reach for them, or should we just give up when we see a world that kind of rewards injustice, to be fair? Do we just give up and say this is what it is and kind of hunker down and take care of self?
My answer to that depends on the day. Because some days I'm like, I'm quitting, I'm going and living on a beach in Barbados. Just bring me coconut water, and I'll be good. I'll live out my life, my God-given goals there. But on good days, on days where I feel like there's more value in continuing the fight, absolutely. The idea of eliminating or bringing about equity, it is incredibly daunting. And as I mentioned, I study social problems. I'm a critical sociologist, so part of what I study is social problems and how can we as a society try to alleviate social problems. And it becomes incredibly daunting when we think about the fact that many of the social problems that I'm studying in 2026 have existed since time. And when I think about that those are the days, when I think too much about that, those are the days that I want to go back and live on a beach in Barbados. However, I do think, as I mentioned earlier, I do think that part of what God intends us to do is in the spaces and places that we find ourselves. Part of living out our full potential and helping others in society to live out their full potential is this constant pursuit of justice. And whether it's from a sociological perspective, where I can look at the evidence and see that over time, while it seems like things never change, there are incremental changes that we can look and we can celebrate, and we can take kind of solace and shalom, have some peace that over time things change. I also have to think about, what does God intend for me to do in the time and in the place that I have been placed? And when I do that, I really, can't help but recognize that I am like a grain of sand or a grain of salt in a vast universe, from centuries before and in the past and what will come ahead of us. And so I can't take on, or none of us should take on, I'm the person to bring justice to this system or to this place. That's the God complex, and that's not what we're intended to do. But I do believe what we're intended to do is to work with God's creation to move us towards justice, to move us towards a more just society, to move us towards a society where people can thrive without those barriers. And when I think about it that way, it becomes a lot more doable, because this pastor once said something a few years ago, and it stuck with me. It's like, if there are problems and you want to solve it, we're not God. We can't solve the problems. We can't fix the problems, but we can do everything we can do with what God has given us and then leave the rest up to God. That doesn't mean that we become complacent and say, well, problems have always existed, they will always exist, so God will fix it. But it does mean that we link ourselves to people in the past and people in the future, as well as those in the present, to do everything in our power to bring about justice now. And in doing so, we have those incremental changes moving us towards the goal, really, the ideal of bringing God's kingdom to earth.
All right, can you talk about some practices that are kind of practical that when you think about a church taking on a justice mindset? What are some practices that come to mind?
Yeah, I have to say, first of all, I see a lot of them in this church already, what you're doing, the intentionality that you have. Even Pastor Joel mentioned today about, you're always referencing things like multiculturalism. And when we think about multiculturalism, of course, part of my study as well is looks at immigration, it looks at ethnicity and race. But when we think about diversity, when we think about pluralism, we think bigger. We think that people can be diverse in their race, their ethnicity, their immigrant status, but also in terms of their gender, in terms of their ideologies, their worldviews, how they grew up. Like, we are a pluralistic society, and we all come with very different worldviews. And I do see in this congregation and in your church the commitment to fostering a place where people with different perspectives can come together. And so I think that is one of the great things that's kept me coming back, is that you're very intentional about that. But I have 3 practical things that come from, not a sociologist, but we use her in sociology quite a bit, Jane Addams. And 3 things that she spoke about to overcoming the tension in society between groups and between the haves and the have-nots and those with privilege and those who lack privilege. The first thing she said to overcome these tensions is to have some formal level of education about the value of just what she calls a social democracy. And don't get too hung up with the word social democracy. I believe that, I know that in some worldviews that can be problematic. But what she means by a social democracy is, it goes back to what I said, a place where people can thrive, live to their full potential, and have all of their needs taken care of. And so, and in doing so, they are able to contribute to society. So a formal education is the first thing, educating ourselves formally on the values of that, doing the work to understand the value of creating a society like that, which in today's society, that work can be challenging because there's a lot of myths out there about some of those terms and what that actually looks like, and social media just adds to that. But so she suggests formally educating ourselves about the truth about how we can live where people thrive. The second thing she suggested is informal education, and informal education comes through engagement with others. So being intentional about engaging with individuals who are outside of your social status, outside of your race, your ethnicity, your immigrant status, your social class, like being intentional about being in those spaces. And the third thing she suggested is being aware of linking an individual and whatever struggle they might have, connecting that to the history of that person, which includes the history of society. But it goes back to that idea of the sociological imagination, not just seeing individuals in this time and in this place as in some cases, in the toughest part of who they are. So if we're looking at a criminal, not just seeing that person who broke the law in that time when they're at probably the bottom of who they are in society, but connecting that individual to all of the things that have led them to where they are, seeing them more holistically, not seeing people in their worst in the worst part, not judging people for the worst things they have done. And if we are intentional about those three things, Adams suggests that we can move towards this idea of attaining social justice.
So can you repeat those? So
Yes.
engaging intentionally, educating ourselves.
Yes. And being intentional about how we see people, not seeing them at their worst and judging them at their worst, but connecting them to seeing them in a more holistic perspective.
Wonderful. That's my biggest challenge. So I often tell this story. CY and I would watch those shows where people cross the border illegally. And like they're like carrying substances, and I'm always like, oh, why are they arresting that person? Like, they're nothing. They don't matter in the system. Like, let them go. And my husband's like, do you know how much fentanyl they were carrying and how much damage they could do? So, yes, I think I lean too far on that. Thankfully, I have some structure in my life. So what I love about this conversation is, for me, justice and social justice and theology all link together, and they're all this beautiful part of what it means to live out our faith as Christ followers. And I find it really interesting in that Matthew 25 passage how strongly it's worded, this is where judgment happens, is when we refuse to lean into acts of justice. And so I often think about justice as not just being about systems, but also about right relationship, because the big picture is so hard sometimes to lean into, and we can't ignore the big picture, but to also lean into those right relationships. How would you define that connection between justice as this overall picture of all things being made right, and shalom, God's work of all things being made right? When we think about words like transformation, when we think about words like community, and when we think about ourselves as a church.
Yeah, I when you pose that question, like an image comes to mind. So imagine yourself and you're walking down the street and you see someone who is obviously struggling. So they can be struggling from an addiction. They can be, just having a bad day and just broken down in tears. They're obviously struggling. Have you ever been in a position like that and gone up to that individual and offer them, it could be just a listening ear, even the words, "Are you okay today? Are you doing okay today?" And if you have ever been in that position, how has that person responded, and then what interaction ensued after that? Now, I get that might be tricky for some of us, especially if you're smaller and more vulnerable. There are times where your safety is of concern. But if you've ever done that and had a person respond to you with just gratitude, just by being asked, "Are you okay?" That question, something so simple, can be so transformative for that person. And it can be transformative for us as well, because a conversation could ensue from just that question, where you see that person or people in similar situations in a different light, where our understanding of struggle that we might not be aware of, our understanding of struggle is just opened up. And we start to see people in a similar struggle in a different light. So when I think about concepts like transformation we think ideally, as a sociologist, a critical sociologist, I want systemic transformation so that we can all achieve justice. And that is important. But not all of us are in a place to fight for that. And so transformation in someone else and in ourselves, I always have to remind myself and others that transformation is mutual. It's not just changing that person, it's changing ourselves as well, or allowing ourselves to be changed. That level of transformation can happen from one simple encounter. And that's where I go back to Adams, being intentional about stepping out of our comfort zone, of what is familiar to us, and doing the thing that is sometimes countercultural and going to the person or to the group who might be seen as problematic, might be seen as, others might want to stay away, and if it's safe, being intentional about approaching that person and offering, even if it's a listening ear. That can be transformational. It has been for me in times of struggling, when I've been struggling and someone sends a text and I'm like, yeah, you just changed my day. I'm still struggling, but that text changed my day. And just reaching out to someone, that can be transformational for both individuals. So in small ways and in big ways as well.
One of the things that I have been thinking about is how the first time I encountered, that I can recall encountering like this kind of direct sense of not belonging and this direct sense of what I'll say is injustice, is we were walking, when I was a kid, I was walking home with my mom from the mailbox, and someone yelled out some really terrible phrases through their window towards us, telling us to get back to Africa, which we're not from, but to get back to Africa, and used expletives towards us. And I was so little, I was probably 7 or 8, and I didn't really even understand what the word meant. I didn't know. I just remember my mom pulling me in and being like, walk faster. And I remember that moment. And as I look back, of course we think about that systemic issue, but then I also wonder if it's not also something that has to do with a theological challenge that we have as well, where as the church, we have this opportunity and we have choices. We have the choice to be churches that really think about, how do I take care of getting people to heaven, which can really leave us with people who make a transformation and a change? Or is there a conversation to be had about, how do I help bring heaven here on earth? What happens when someone like that encounters a community of people who say there's a different way and there's a better way? What happens when churches don't just be like a city on a hill that people come to, but are more like a city on the hill where they kind of put out banquet tables out in front and bring the banquet tables down the hill and invite people to participate? And so I think, the role of the church in the world is so essential. And I think it's something we've often taken off the table. This idea that we are intended as transformed people to lean into building and bringing about transformation. Not just, by preaching, which is a beautiful part of it, but also by the ways that of the organizations that we support, by the places that we volunteer, by the person that we notice and say hello to, by the person who's on the outside in our schools or in our workplaces, and making sure that they know that there's space for them too. They might not be our best friend coming to every party, but we can sit beside them in class and make sure that they know that they belong. And so as a church, I hope that as we think about and wrestle with that word justice, which holds a lot of tensions for us, that we don't only think about it sociologically, and we don't only think about it politically, because that's where everybody wants to land, but that we think about it theologically, and we think about it as Christ followers. What does it look like for me to be someone who says, when I encounter the least of these, they find themselves being fed. They find themselves no longer thirsty. They find themselves no longer naked. They find themselves with someone who sits with them, even though they may need to remain in bondage. That they find themselves with someone who walks them towards accountability. That they find someone who can be an active protection around them when they're vulnerable, a voice, an advocate. That it's not just, and I love the big picture. I get stuck there sometimes. But how do we as West Springs Church also make sure that justice is not something that we just whisper about, but something that we live out day by day in all of the places that we go? Thank you, Dr. Monetta B, for your words and your wisdom. As we go from here, I'm going to get you to stand, stretch your feet just before you go and get your ice cream. I want you to think about the places where you are invited to set out a banquet table, a table of invitation, where you are invited to go out into the corners, the highways and byways. That has quickly become one of my favorite passages of Scripture, where the highways and byways to invite people to come and join the conversation, to let people know that they too can find belonging. How do we as a church live out our values of Jesus-centeredness, wisdom-seeking, radical belonging, and impactful action in ways that are justice-centered, in ways that help people to connect with who Jesus is? Those are the questions that, as you eat ice cream and as you go out into the world, that I hope that you can sit with. And I'm just going to pray with us before we head out. God, we thank you for your invitation to us throughout Scripture to lean in, to care and notice the least of these, to notice whoever is the orphan in our day and age, whoever is the widow without a family member to support them in our time, whoever it is that is in bondage in our situation, in our circle, whoever is on the outskirts, whoever it is who is so easily forgotten and left behind. God, help us to be people who not only speak about this, but people who begin to take notice, who begin to pay attention to where it is that you are at work. And then may we be open to your Spirit guiding us, leading us, moving us towards action. God, give us opportunity to be your hands and your feet right where we are. In your name, amen. Have a blessed week.